In the 15th century, England was a kingdom divided, a realm split between two rival houses, both descended from Edward III. One bore the red rose, Lancaster, the other the white rose, York. It was a war not merely of armies, but of bloodlines, a civil struggle that would tear England apart for over 3 decades. The wars of the roses. And within the storm of betrayal and ambition, one prince's name would be written in both glory and infamy. His name was George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother to kings, traitor to both, and a man whose legend would end in wine. George was born in Dublin, 1449, the son of Richard, Duke of York, and Sally Neville. He was the third surviving son, not expected to rule, but destined to stand close to power. Even as a child, George grew in the shadow of political turmoil. England's throne, weakened by Henry VI's bouts of madness, was a prize that beckoned to his father, Richard, and so began the blood feud between York and Lancaster. George's father would die at Wakefield, his head displayed on the gates of York, crowned mockingly with paper. From that moment, loyalty was a currency that York brothers spent with care and treachery, the language of survival. In 1461, George's eldest brother Edward seized the throne after victory at Taunton, one of the bloodiest battles in English history. The House of York had triumphed, for now. George, then barely 12, was elevated to Duke of Clarence, a title that placed him among the highest nobles of the realm. His coat of arms bore the quartered lilies of France and the lions of England, a promise of power. But Clarence was not content to be a bystander. From his youth he showed signs of restless ambition, and those around him whispered that he was too easily swayed by power, by persuasion, by pride. No figure loomed larger in Clarence's early life than Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker. He was the architect of York's victory and, in many ways, the true power behind the throne. Warwick saw in George something malleable, a young, impressionable duke with royal blood and hunger for recognition, and George saw in Warwick a mentor, perhaps even a father figure. But alliances in this age were fragile, and ambition was rarely pure. In 1469, against his brother the king's wishes, George married Isabel Neville, Warwick's daughter. The union joined bloodlines and ambition, York and Neville, throne and power broker. The wedding took place in Calais, in defiance of Edward IV's authority. It was an open act of rebellion, dressed as romance. By wedding Warwick's daughter, George had aligned himself with the most dangerous man in England, a man capable of making and unmaking kings. The die was cast. In 1469, Warwick turned against Edward IV, claiming corruption had poisoned the royal court. Clarence joined him, issuing proclamations in the name of justice, but his motives were anything but noble. Together, they captured Edward and briefly seized control of the government, but the experiment failed. Without the king's charisma, the realm fractured. For the first time, George realized what it meant to play with thrones and lose. Warwick and Clarence fled to France, where they forged a shocking alliance. They would restore the Lancastrian line, their former enemies, in the place of Henry VI, back on the throne. In 1470, England was once again changed kings. Warwick's rebellion succeeded. Henry VI was resorted, frail and bewildered, to the throne of England. For a brief moment, George stood triumphant, his brother deposed, his alliance secured, and his place in history seemingly assured. But in his triumph lay his doom. He had betrayed his brother for ambition. Now he will learn the price of treachery. The tides of fortune in the Wars of the Roses turned faster than loyalty could follow, and soon the wheel of fate would bring both Warwick and Clarence crashing down. By the spring of 1471, England's civil war burned anew. King Edward IV, exiled, defamed, betrayed, crossed the Channel to reclaim his throne, and among those who once conspired against him was his own brother, George. Warwick's rebellion was collapsing. His Lancastrian alliance had faltered, and in a final act of political calculation, George abandoned his father-in-law and sought Edward's forgiveness. He knew Edward's nature, merciful when it suited him, and he gambled correctly that blood was thicker than revenge. In April 1471, Edward returned to England and crushed Warwick's army at Barnet. Warwick was slain, and the last hopes of Lancaster were extinguished. Weeks later, at Tewkesbury, where the young Prince Edward of Lancaster, Henry VI, heir, was killed. By May, the Yorkist crown was secure again. Henry VI himself was executed in the Tower, and standing beside Edward IV once more was his pardoned brother, George. But the seeds of suspicion had been sown. Edward could forgive betrayal, but never forget it. For several years, George attempted to rebuild his influence. He was still Duke of Clarence, and, by inheritance and proximity, one of the most powerful nobles in England. But he was restless, haunted by jealousy of his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whose loyalty and success in northern campaigns won him favor with Edward. George's mind, once sharp and calculating, began to turn bitter. He accused courtiers of conspiring against him, whispered that the king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had corrupted the crown, and that Edward's children might not be legitimate heirs. Even his wife, Isabel Neville, could not calm his temper. She died suddenly in 1476, possibly from childbirth complication, but George believed poison was the blame. He accused the Queen's kin of murder. He would pay dearly for that accusation. In the years after Isabel's death, Clarence's paranoia grew. He accused officials of treachery, imprisoned servants on suspicion of witchcraft, and even staged false trials. One of his retainers, John Thursby, was executed without due process, a direct challenge of royal authority. Edward IV's patience snapped. He summoned Clarence to London to answer for his crimes, but George refused. He spoke openly that the king was unfit to rule, and that he, George, should have been chosen instead. The thrift between brothers had returned, wider than ever. In June 1477, George was arrested for high treason. The charges were sweeping, rebellion, sedition, and conspiracy against the king himself. Among the accusations was correspondence with foreign powers, even whispers of renewed alliances with France or Burgundy. For a royal prince, triumph of peers was a grim formality. The outcome had been decided long before it began. In January 1478, the Duke of Clarence was brought before Parliament. His brother, King Edward IV, presided over the session, torn between royal duty and blood. Witnesses read confessions, letters, and accusations. The court fell silent as the king finally rose. Edward's voice was heavy with regret, but firm. "He is my brother by nature, yet my enemy by his own choosing." The verdict was inevitable, guilty of treason. His death sentence was confirmed, but its manner would remain a matter of whispered rumor and legend. In February of 1478, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, was led to his cell in the Tower, the same place where his father and Henry VI had met their ends. The official record states only that he was privately executed, but history remembers something far more macabre. According to historians like Edward Hall and Raphael Holinshed, Clarence chose to die not by sword nor a rope, but by drowning in a butt of Melsmere wine. It was a fitting end for a man of indulgence and vanity, or perhaps a cruel legend crafted to humiliate his memory. Whether true or not, the image endures, a prince's life ending beneath the service of his own excess. Edward IV never spoke publicly of his brother's death again. Some say it haunted him, that he aged rapidly, grown heavy with guilt. Others claim the act restored order, that justice had been served. But to the people of England, George, becoming a warning, a reminder of how ambition could destroy even the noblest blood. He was buried at Tewkesbury Abbey, beside his wife Isabel Neville. Reunited in death, the two marked, not by grandeur, but quiet humility. George's life stands as a mirror to the chaos of his age. A prince blessed with power, cursed by pride. A man caught between loyalty and ambition, whose fatal flaw was believing he could outplay kings. In the centuries that followed, his death became legend, his betrayal a cautionary tale. But perhaps in the end, George was simply a man born to a family that devoured its own.